Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Gray Matter. Well, we have another great guest on today who is going to be talking to us within the realm of the general topic of politics and culture. We're going to get to that in a moment, but before we do that, a couple of announcements. Well, one's an announcement and one is more of a sales pitch. I'm very honored to have been asked by Grace Church of California to be part of a documentary that they are creating. And this documentary is going to be about Pastor James Coates and Pastor Timothy Stevens, the two courageous, faithful pastors, wonderful men, honorable men, who were imprisoned by the Alberta government during the COVID-19 pandemic. I had the privilege of being their lawyer and still am on behalf of both they and their respective churches. Anyway, this film crew is coming from California, and they're going to be visiting our offices in Cold Lake, and I'm going to be interviewed as part of that documentary. So I'm very honored and pleased about that, and we're going to reproduce some parts of that documentary when they become available as part of Gray Matter. Secondly, I just want to invite everyone, if they're interested, to check out our merchandise, which is available on our website and also on our various platforms. There's sweatshirts and t-shirts there. And if you want to support the show, then we ask you to go there and do that. And as always, if you are willing, go onto YouTube and subscribe, because that helps us apparently in terms of training the algorithms. So if you can support the show, if you want to support the show, please do that. Okay, so let's get down to today's discussion. Today we have someone on who is, let's say, a mover and a shaker. In politics, everyone in the public will see the people who are out front, you know, the Danielle Smiths and the Jason Kennys or the Justin Trudeaus of the world. But behind the scenes, making all of that happen, behind Pierre Poilievre's successful run for the Conservative leadership, are many, many very hardworking, intelligent, and dedicated people who behind the scenes raising money, garnering support, making sure that people get out to vote. And our guest today is someone who has been very involved in that capacity in Canadian politics for a long time. His name is George Bears. That in and of itself is interesting. However, what's even more interesting to us is that more recently, he has turned his attention to, let's say, political activism. So he's sort of gone from an influencer to an activist. And he can argue with me about that characterization if he likes. He's welcome to. But he's part of an organization that is doing incredible work in support of individual Canadians and Canadian families impacted by COVID-19 lockdowns and vaccine mandates and all manner of government overreach and oppression. His name is George Bears. So we're going to get to him in a moment and introduce him properly. But before we do that, as we always do, we're going to go to our aphorisms board. And some of these are obviously in honor of our guest, and I hope he's not offended by the first one, because the author of this quotation is perhaps the most vilified person of the 20th century. But the quotation is poignant, and so that's why it's here. It was Adolf Hitler who said this. Although in German he said this: the receptivity of the masses is very limited. Their intelligence is small, but their power of forgetting is enormous. In consequence of these facts, all effective propaganda must be limited to a very few points, and must harp on these in slogans until the last member of the public understands what you want him or her to understand by your slogan. That's from Mein Kampf, and the reason why I mention it is it has particular application to the type of propaganda that we were all exposed to, and we continue to be exposed to concerning COVID-19. The second quotation is from someone, let's say, who is a much more honorable man, at least in my estimation. One of the key framers of the American Constitution, actually drafted the Declaration of Independence. This is from Thomas Jefferson. When the people fear their government, there is tyranny. When the government fears the people, there is liberty. And finally, from our dearly departed Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, who was quoted as saying, "When life seems hard, the courageous do not lie down and accept defeat. Instead, they are all the more determined to struggle for a better future." God rest her, our Queen, Her Majesty. All right, so let's talk about our guest, George Bears. George Bears is a strong visionary and principled influential leader who has developed expertise working with charitable and commercial enterprises, corporate donors, financial institutions, and lenders, and has secured funding for oil and gas, mining, real estate development, the tech sector, and for charitable organizations. He has extensive experience as an owner and operator of his own companies. He also has a very unique gift of identifying and connecting key people and talent for a given project and building strong, principled, best-in-class, world-class teams. George served for 5 years from 1986 to 1991 in Ottawa as National Director with Victims of Violence in the Canadian criminal justice system, advocating in Parliament and across the country for surviving family members who lost loved ones to homicide. He personally spearheaded Canada's first and only national unsolved homicide research and identification program. He also established a national missing children's registry. I'll just stop for a moment and show you my sweatshirt, this is concerning missing murdered Indigenous women in George's honor. George worked with key federal members of Parliament to make many critical policy changes to parole regulations, and he played a significant role in the extradition of serial killer Charles Ng, who sits on death row at San Quentin, California, for their premeditated murder of 12 innocent men, women, and children. George continued to work with key political leaders for additional causes over the years. He was one of the founders and directors of the Foundation for National Policy Trust Canada, a public policy action group working with Roy Byer on a national campaign to defend traditional marriage. This campaign, with Roy's leadership, went on to win 26 key ridings in Southern Ontario and Manitoba to help elect our former Prime Minister, Stephen Harper. So with all of that, if that weren't enough, he's the founder of something called TBOF, and he's going to talk about that today. Welcome to the program, George Bears.
Thank you so much, Leighton. It's great to be here and wonderful to see you again.
Okay, so can you tell us about TBOF and how it got started?
You know, Leighton, I'm sure you can relate to this. Well, I know you can relate to this. When the please accept lockdowns for the next 2 weeks to flatten the curve happened in late March, early April, 2020. At the time, I thought, okay, well, that's interesting. But I'm perfectly healthy. My family's perfectly healthy. What are we talking about lockdowns? Never in the history of science, and I'm no scientist, but never in the history of science do you ever lock up the people who are not sick under any epidemic. And it seemed odd at the time, and by the time 2 weeks had turned into 2 months, it went from being odd to just downright bizarre. Completely bizarre. And I remember talking to a number of my friends, one who became one of our directors and co-founders on Taking Back Our Freedoms, Roy Byer, as well as talking to hotelier Greg Irwin, who's a very dear friend and owns the High Country Inn in Banff, Alberta, and is third generation hotelier in Banff. And he was sharing with me the devastation that was about to be hitting Banff, Alberta in the spring of 2020 in the earliest stages. And, it was just going to be pure devastation, which of course, not only in Banff, but right across the province, right across the country, and quite frankly, right around the globe, turned out to be just an extraordinarily damaging time for just, and the least of which, just the economy itself, let alone all of the other collateral damage. That was in April, May 2020. And, I have become very good friends with a Canadian hero. I call him a Canadian hero because he is one. Ted Kuntz is the president of Vaccine Choice Canada. And while I didn't know Ted Kuntz in August of 2021, August 21st to be exact, I was watching a podcast with Ted, and one of his guests was another dear friend of mine now, and that was Vince Gersey's Police for Freedom. And I'll never forget what Vince said. He said, this is a hill to die on. And it was over the next few days, Julie, my wife, and I had been talking for the most of the month of July in 2021. We have got to do something. And we saw the very good work that was being done by Vaccine Choice Canada, Action for Canada. I'd love to call these organizations because, whether it's Tanya or Ted or many others, Sandy Sabo with Take Action Canada, we saw the work that was being done across the country, including JCCF with John Carpy and the work they were doing. And yet when Roy Byer and I were talking, we're saying one of the areas that we see a gap in, and I say that with the great respect for so many other movements across the country since then, that we've been working with all of them in a harmonious way. But we saw that there needed to be a pressure on elected officials, both provincially and federally across the country. And with the combined experience that we both had, we thought we need to do something, and we need to push that agenda and push all of the lawyers doing such exceptional things, yourself included, in the various courts. There was a court, although I'm not a lawyer, the court that I've worked in most of my life has been the court of public opinion. Mm-hmm. And we believed if we could begin to change the court of public opinion, we could begin to have some impact. Never realizing what would happen over the next few months. It was on August 22nd, the day after Vaccine Choice podcast, that we resolved that we were going to take, we thought, a few months off from some of our businesses, and it turned out to be much longer than that. Mm-hmm. We knew we needed to start something that was going to achieve that end. And mm-hmm. quite frankly, over the next few weeks, I locked myself away in the office for 15 hours a day, and I was, transcribing podcasts of everything from Dr. Ryan Cole to Dr. Pierre Corey to Dr. Hodkinson, and the list went on. And I was hoping beyond hope to find that, it's not as bad as I thought. And of course, the exact opposite began to happen. Mm-hmm. And I'll never forget, I never met Dr. Eric down in Idaho. But looking at his information, he talked about Dr. Eric Cole, talking right. about the number of deaths since the spring of 2021 and being until about October 15th, 2021, being more deaths from the vax than the previous 30 years of all of the different vaxes combined. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden it's like, okay, we have a major problem here. And mm-hmm. I believe it was divine providence that took over from there. We've been fortunate to build a tremendous organization, starting on our board of advisors. The first person on our board of advisors was Dr. Roger Hodkinson. And what can we say? An amazing man, just an amazing mm-hmm. man, and so committed and such a voice for truth in the medical community. Mm-hmm. And it was through Dr. Hodkinson joining our team. We soon had Dr. Jessica Rose from, she lives in Haifa, Israel, works very closely with Dr. Peter McCullough. She joined our board of advisors. And then one day someone handed me Premier Brian Peckford's phone number, and we did a Zoom call. And on that first call, maybe it's coming from Prince Edward Island, he's from Newfoundland. I can't describe it, but that first call with Premier Peckford was an amazing call, and we were humbled that he would agree to join as our chairman of the board. And this young fledgling, yet to be incorporated, not for what would soon become a not-for-profit, and taking back our freedoms, had really begun to gain some early momentum, and mm-hmm. from that. The organization continued building out. And I'll never forget, after Premier Peckford and Jessica Rose, Dr. Jessica Rose and Dr. Roger Hodkinson, the three of them and Roy and I were constantly brainstorming on collective Zooms. And it was on November 11th. This is a very fitting day last fall, mm-hmm. in honor of amazing gentleman. Roy and I had one previous call with Lieutenant Colonel David Redmond before that. But on November 11th, which of course is Remembrance Day, this Canadian war hero, and that's what he is. He's a Canadian hero, Lieutenant Colonel David Redmond. And on November 11th, we had a 4-hour conversation with him, and we were so moved that he would agree to come on our board of advisors. And here's a man that not only led, had that amazing military career, but in 2001, following the day after 9/11, then Premier Ralph Klein talked to David and appointed him as counterterrorism chief for Alberta. And like everything else that Mr. Redmond has ever done, he had done such an exemplary job here in Alberta. He was outsourced not only across the country, but he's had quite a number of areas of consultation to our U.S. partners as well. And of course, during the it was after that, about 2007, he drafted the Emergency Act, and I support the Emergency Act. If my wife and I live in a place like Fort McMurray and there's a forest fire two hours away from our home, and our police force us out of our home if we're too foolish to leave, then that's what the Emergency Act was meant for. But as David Redmond will tell you, it was never meant to be misused like it's been misused by the Kenney government over the last couple of years. So again, having a man of such credibility in this battle, so we could see the team coming together. And after that, we had a tremendous group from Dr. Byron Bridle to Dr. Paul Alexander to Dr. Patrick Phillips to Dr. Eric Payne. When I was on the phone on the Zoom call with Jessica Rose, she asked me if I knew Danny Bulford, and I said I don't, and she said I need to have him give you a call if that'd be okay. And of course, Corporal Danny Bulford, who used to be a sharpshooter, protecting both Prime Ministers Trudeau and Harper since about 2011, 2012, he joined because he also wouldn't take the jab. A wonderful guy, Corporal Bulford. We've become very dear friends. On the very first call, he asked me if I knew this Constable Brian Dennison from the Calgary Police Service, who had just recently had a go viral that he didn't intend that to happen, but he had left the Calgary Police Service because he did not agree with the mandates or the vax as well. And I said, I've known Brian for 31 years. And just amazing how the serendipity happened. And then we had the great privilege of having Dr. Julie Paness join our board of advisors. And I hope I'm not missing some of our advisors. But really what ended up happening is we now had a team with the collective and the diversity of the skill sets that could really begin to work together and help to put a strategy together. And, I have so much respect for Roy and all of Premier Peckford and everyone. And then we started talking to some truckers here in December, and some of them were already looking to do something significant. And as they say, mid-January, that whole convoy started. We were following them. We diverted. We took a detour. We got to Ontario and went down because we were speaking with myself and Brian and Roy. We're speaking at the Rainbow Bridge on January 26th, I believe it was, 27th, I guess, with Dr. Paul Alexander and Dr. Julie Paness. And then I drove up with Dr. Alexander to Ottawa. And, when we got to Ottawa, it was unlike anything I've ever seen. And, to go back to the initial motivation is in August of 2021, we thought we need to do this. And what was going to be a few months now, TVOF, we knew by Christmas time, it would probably evolve into being a legacy organization so that even when the carnage gets cleaned up, we will be an ongoing advocacy so that never again can we ever let anything like this ever happen again. And I had the privilege of replacing myself as president of the organization in May of this year. Andrei Litvinenko has taken over as CEO, and I guess what you call a lifetime co-founder and board member. And I'm privileged to be a part of such a great team. And really, my wife Julie and I have a 21-year-old son, Noah, and a 19-year-old son, Caleb, and a 17-year-old daughter, Brooklyn. And we really were highly motivated because we didn't want them to take the jab. And I can say, thanks to the good Lord today, none of them have. We haven't. And I'm so thankful for that. But I believe we've been privileged as a team to have made a very good impact along with the many other freedom organizations. I guess that's a tremendously long answer to your question.
Yeah, no, that's great background. Obviously, you have a real all-star cast there. I've had the pleasure of getting to know Dr. Roger Hodkinson through my involvement with the Alberta Prosperity Project. He was also kind enough to appear on this program. Dave Redmond, I had the pleasure of getting to know because he was an expert witness in the Ingram case on emergencies. And he certainly is, I don't know anybody who knows more about that topic than he does. If he's listening, Dave, my invitation to have you come on this program is still open. He's turned me down about 3 times, but with this face, I can't take no for an answer. George, I want to talk a little bit more about TBOF. So on the website, it talks about your message. It's sort of your mission statement. It says that TBOF was originally founded to push back against and secure the full repeal of all COVID-19 vaccination mandates. During our struggle against these immoral, unethical, and unconstitutional measures, we realized that the pandemic's entire mismanagement and resulting restrictions were merely a symptom of a greater malaise in Canadian society. And it goes on to state, over decades and by 1,000 cuts, the integrity of our public institutions and legislatures has been eroded, the rule of law compromised, and fundamental human dignity subverted by corrosive moral relativism. So the way I read that is that Take Back Our Freedoms may have had its genesis in the COVID-19 pandemic, but it has a much broader scope, a much broader vision, and its mandate is really just beginning, isn't it? Because there are deeper problems going on in society that you talk about on the website, and the COVID-19 lockdowns are really just symptomatic of those, aren't they?
That's such a good point. Obviously, C-19 and quite frankly, the fraud that it's been really is turning out to be really just the wake-up call for Canadians, myself included, to really begin to be vigilant in holding those elected officials, from school boards to police commissions to municipal, provincial, federal, and everything in between. We have an amazing country called Canada. And, we have a choice. And I say this in honor of a great war hero, Lieutenant Colonel David Redmond, and all the others with him. You think about the 1940s, and I just use one battle alone, those young boys from 18, sometimes 17, lying about their age so they could fight and defend our country. Those young boys between 18 and 25 who stormed the beaches of Normandy. And the majority of them died on that beach that day. And that's only one battle. We could go on and on and on with many other battles, many other wars. We're either going to take a stand and fight for this great, amazing country called Canada, or we may as well just spit on their graves. And that sounds harsh, but that's what the alternatives are. And that's my invitation to all Canadians to get involved. And they don't have to agree with us. One of the things that's been lost in all of this, and thanks to big tech and thanks to the mainstream media, is the whole issue of critical thinking. You and I wouldn't agree on everything. Does that mean that we don't even discuss it and have good critical thought about what's going on? And particularly when you look at the young generation. So to your point, it may have started with C-19 and the lockdowns and the social distancing and the masking and the jabs and all of that. But it shed a light on the issues of due process, rule of law, over on the medical side, informed consent, do no harm, and so many other things that are really tied to our freedoms. When you're talking about those incredible Pastors Coates and Pastor Stevens and so many others, whoever would have even imagined in 2015 we'd ever see that in this country? So really, where we go from here is not only beginning to hold those elected and those within the bureaucracy accountable, but then once they're held accountable, then to re-examine what we're doing with these bureaucracies and how are they going to be transformed to begin to serve Canadians instead of Canadians having to bow down and get their services from these politicians and these bureaucracies. And within both, there's some wonderful people, but within both, there's a need to hold those accountable. And quite frankly, I really hope over the next 5 to 10 years, I said a while ago, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic, supposed pandemic, has cast such a tyranny over Canada and the world. May it be said that over the next 10 years, when we look back at 2030, may we look back and find through providence, it turned out to be the greatest awakening of the citizenry, starting here in Canada, that the world has ever known. And that we begin to take serious our responsibility to be vigilant and be engaged at the constituent association level, at every level of our government, to really engage and say, no, this is how it's going to be. So that's what's evolved in, I guess you could say, the legacy of what we've been discussing the last year, of where TBOF really sees where we can play a significant part and a practical part in that on the go forward.
George, organizations like yours must be pleased to see some of the developments that have happened, say, over the past 9 months or so. Of course, the Freedom Convoy did a great deal to bring about the end of lockdowns, and most recently we saw the federal government finally repeal these ridiculous travel restrictions that were so, well, first of all, by their own admission, had no scientific basis whatsoever. And of course, our Prime Minister, in typical ridiculous fashion, now says that the science that they didn't follow to begin with when they imposed the mandates is the basis for their removal of the mandates. If you can follow that logic, then you're much more clever than I am. But the point is, would you agree with this, George? We're entering a really crucial moment in Canada and in the West. And I think it's a moment that the people who have subjected us to this oppression have calculated. And I would say the real danger that we have in Canada, and you just talked about this, is complacency. Yeah. Because although the federal government, for example, has removed, the provincial government has removed lockdowns measures, and although the federal government has removed, let's say, the travel restrictions, I have not heard the federal government in particular take responsibility. I have not heard them apologize. I have not heard them say that they are going to give up the very powers that they exercised to impose all of this. And nor have I, and most importantly, this comes back to your point, nor have I heard any government in Canada commit to a public inquiry into these lockdowns, into these measures, to ask the important questions, the 16 key questions that Preston Manning has framed in his paper, you know, the COVID inquiry. So, George, would you agree with me that we're in a very key moment right now where organizations like yours really need to remain vigilant on this issue of accountability?
There's no question about that. No question about that at all. And, you know, way back in December and January of this past year, I remember Premier Peckford and I talking on just one-on-one on Zoom calls, and we were talking about what comes next on the accountability side. And there's a number of things. Eventually, there needs to be the investigation on the criminality of what's happened regarding these crimes against humanity the last couple of years. But what is the next step? and in concert with Mr. Manning, and I have great respect for him. We were talking, Brian and I were talking last December, January, February of, maybe a royal commission, maybe something. And I remember talking to Mr. Peckford, and way back in 1987, in a whole different era, Jim Edwards was a former member of Parliament, a wonderful man, actually, Conservative member of Parliament from Edmonton West, good friend of mine. And on June 23rd, 1985, Air India left Toronto and blew up over Northern Ireland. 328 people died in that crash. It was a terrorist bombing. Died in that crash. Of the 328, 295 were Canadians. One of the 295 was his chief of staff. And I ended up finding myself very involved in that inquiry. I knew Dr. Pollywell really well. He was a good friend. And one of our key guys died just before June of 88, I guess it was. And I was asked to step in and do some work with them. And I was like a co-chair of the Air India disaster for a couple of years. And of course, that went to a royal inquiry, only to find that the only results of that was to create a public relations program for the various politicians over the next 25 years, and nothing ever done. And that inquiry still sits collecting dust for just the sham that whole inquiry was. And I remember saying to Brian, 10 years as a premier, he knows what, the frustrations he's dealt with various provinces and the federal government in those days with the same type of thing. And one of the things we had talked about back then is, why don't we do a citizens inquiry, citizen-led, citizen-funded, citizen-directed? And as we started discussing that and discussing with our good friend Ted Kuntz and a few others, and David Ross out at Canadian COVID Care Alliance, David is a very good friend as well. Great organizations doing great things. Then all of a sudden, the team in Canada, people from different aspects of the freedom movement. And, God bless Preston Manning for his leadership role in that as well. We're now working together as a team. And I know every week, Andre, our CEO, and Mr. Peckford are working with the team, the other freedom groups some of the other freedom groups across the country, including CCCA and Vaccine Choice and others. And really the objective, and it's absolutely mission critical. And this goes right back to that terrible quote from Mein Kampf. And I wasn't put off by that at all. If there's anything that might be a wake up to us, is what one of the most evil men the world has ever known, Adolf Hitler himself, said. He spoke truth there when he said, is it ever, it's such an advantage that we have such short memories. We can never forget. We can never forget who stormed the beaches of Normandy. We can never forget the death camps and all of those Jews murdered and others murdered besides. We can never forget, and we can never be so arrogant to think that it can't happen to us. And if there's anything that's happened in the last 2 years, the wake-up call for all Canadians, and more and more and more and more are waking up now. We have to get accountability. And I might add, one of the greatest desires I have in seeing this citizens inquiry, this COVID inquiry go across the country, one of the greatest things that can happen is an awakening to those who are still in denial. And I can understand them being in denial. Who could imagine this could really happen? But it is. And these are facts, and it's not hyperbole. This is not a tin hat conspiracy. We've got the evidence. And I really hope and believe that one of the great things that can come from this is an awakening of Canadians from coast to coast, from Bonavista to Tofino, and really begin to say, we can never let this happen again. And we can never forget 9/11. We can never forget the Second World War. We can never forget the death camps. We can never forget this past 30 months. And we need to memorialize it by identifying the problem, bringing to account those responsible, following the rule of law, restoring the amazing Charter of Rights and Freedoms that's already entrenched, and improving upon it too, absolutely. But through this, taking this and using it from the freedom side and moving it ahead to envision a Canada stronger, a true North, strong and free, stronger than we've ever known. And maybe that's Canada going forward. Maybe it's a series of sovereign provinces. That reconfiguring, I'm open to whatever is going to work. But here's what I'm not open to. Not now, not ever, is Ottawa. Canada is a target for the globalists all over the world. Klaus Schwab and all of them, they're looking at Canada. Why Canada? Our greatest neighbor, the greatest pillar of freedom in the world is the United States of America. My wife's from there. I love America. I love Canada as well. But if they can destroy the resolve and the morale of the people of this country, it's no different than destroying the morale of Great Britain during the Second World War. Churchill ensured that they were not going to do that. We as Canadians have to ensure, no, not today. It's not going to happen in Canada. And if that is correct, that we are a number one target in the world, and there's no question we are, then within Canada, there's no question that the greatest freedom province, and I love Canadians from coast to coast, and then I could name you heroes from every single province I've had the privilege of working with. I love them all. But the greatest concentration of the freedom movement in Canada is this beloved Alberta. And one thing Albertans are saying from Mackenzie County right down to Coots is we're never, ever, ever going to let this happen again. And that's so encouraging.
I'm glad that you made that point about Alberta. We were just talking about this actually with another guest, Professor Salim Mansour, about Alberta and Alberta's sort of unique position within Canada. We have the potential to be potentially Canada's salvation. And it's important for people in other parts of the country, and I know you understand this, but many people in central Canada talk about things like Western alienation.
Right.
The independence movement, if you want to call it that in Alberta, is nothing more or less than a survival movement. It is fundamentally and principally a rejection of globalism, of the World Economic Forum, of the surrender of Canadian sovereignty. What Albertans are talking about, it's not the same brand of separatism that Quebec tried to achieve in 1980 and 1995. What is happening in Alberta is being born out of necessity. It's being born out of the same sort of thing that caused the American revolutionaries 250 years ago to break away from Britain. It's abuse and overreach, and we want to preserve the best parts of Canada. It's the Canada in which we live. But I think what most Albertans really want is they want to stop this globalist agenda, and Alberta is, I think, perfectly situated to do that, better situated than any other province in Canada. Would you agree with that?
Oh my gosh, I surely would. I go back again to the education that my two boys got when they were with us in Ottawa. We spent considerable hours in the Ark Hotel. Roy was doing a lot of work with the truckers, as were other organizations. I was mostly working with the doctors and others doing the speaking on Parliament Hill at that time. And, we were going 16, 18 hours a day. And it wasn't until a couple of days later did we even realize that this thing had gone global on the trucking convoy. And what's my point on that? And how does that tie back to Alberta? The entire trucking convoy founding and birth of that started with the truckers and started with the people of Alberta. And, Alberta, even if I lived in Newfoundland or I lived in any other part of the country, you look to Alberta. They've always looked to Alberta. And that's why we as Albertans, I come from Prince Edward Island. I love PEI. But Alberta has always been that place where we knew we could have self-determination, where we knew we could follow a dream and hard work, us Maritimers. The thing that really grieved me about the Maritimes when I left there in the 80s was the whole unemployment insurance and the whole welfare system beginning to penetrate the culture. You came to this land of the free in Alberta because it was a can-do place, a can-do province, a place that has enormous resources. And, you know, on the very point that you make, I want to give a huge shout out to our mutual friend, Dr. Dennis Modry. You know, here's a man who retired at 65, and just if he would have retired and gone to a beach for the rest of his life, then he would have had an amazing legacy as being the first surgeon in Canada to ever successfully do a whole series of heart and lung transplants. But he followed what he knew was the calling on his life to always fight for Albertans. And, you know, talk about independence. Yes, absolutely. And if that's what it takes, I'm all in. But really what his heart is always been, for as long as I've known him, and he's become a great friend, he has that courage, resolve, and commitment to ensure for all Albertans that we as Albertans, whether it's in a sovereign state within Canada or whether it has the necessity to become an independent state, I'll support whatever's necessary, but we'll never support the federal government locking us down and doing what they've done the last 2 years, because if they've done in the last 2 years, you can rest assured they're going to try to do it in the future. So what he's done is he's sent a message across Alberta and across the country for that matter, that we need to have greater leverage of our natural resources, of our finances, and of our right to self-determination. And Ottawa no longer dictating that. And that's a message that's resonating all over, not only all over Alberta, it's resonating all over Western Canada. And that's the kind of tenacious, courageous metal that Albertans are made of. You know, they pulverize us these last 2 years, and we get back up on our feet and say, no, not today. And, you know, it's quite likely we're going to have a freedom candidate. There's a couple of freedom candidates that, you know, another thing that Taking Back Our Freedoms had great success in doing. I said to Brian, my birthday is on February 23rd. And I said to Brian Peckford, that was on a Wednesday. I said to him the previous Friday, Taking Back Our Freedoms led the charge on this, but we had great cooperation and huge support from Vaccine Choice and Take Action Canada and Action for Canada, a number of the organizations doing a massive phone and email campaign to senators in Ottawa. Now that almost sounds like, how could that have any impact? They're not elected. We said if they get enough calls, we'll see what will happen. And we had, during that 9 or 10 day time with that Emergency Act, the largest number of calls and emails that went to the Senate of Canada that's ever happened in Canadian history. And about 2 hours before Trudeau came out and announced the end of the Emergency Act, I got a heads up from the guys in Ottawa, and they said, you know, he doesn't have the support of the Senate, even on the Liberal side. And, you know, that was a huge victory. O'Toole even was a huge victory. Then we came back to Alberta and we worked with another couple of organizations and put pressure on the Kenney government. I was a supporter of Kenney when he came in, but, you know, to put us under what we've been through the last couple of years and see pastors being arrested under his watch, we were very fortunate to see that there's now a leadership happening in this province. And, you know, I believe one of the freedom candidates are going to win that. We're hoping so. But it's that continuing to be vigilant, and Alberta represents the hope for the country in how they lead the charge in that.
You know, George, there are 3 things in particular that I find most impressive about Take Back Our Freedoms. The first, obviously, is the quality of the people who you've brought in, you've assembled.
Thank you.
On your board. Secondly, are the values that are listed on the webpage: the truth and integrity, liberty and duty, compassion and courage. Those are great words, wonderful values. But the third thing, and maybe the most important thing of all that I really like about TBOF, is that this is not an intellectual think tank. This is an organization that moves and shakes its boots on the ground. And in addition to the Freedom Convoy, you've also been involved in a number of other really important campaigns, in particular your support for James Topp. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, James is an amazing guy. James, marched from Vancouver right through to Ottawa, had an amazing conference and met with members of Parliament in Ottawa in late June, and then of course went the full distance right out to St. John's, Newfoundland, and all through the Maritimes. James, a man of impeccable integrity, a man who served in the military of Canada, but also served with the RCMP as well. But like Corporal Danny Bulford, like Constable Brian Dennison, police officers like military hero Lieutenant Colonel David Redmond, stood with exceptional integrity. But not only stood with integrity, you talk about action, action, action. I can't even imagine in the cold of the winter with those army boots on and a series of them, so he could still walk at the end of the day, to march out to Ottawa. And the impact that made, the message that sent to all Canadians, and particularly the elites in office and the elites in the bureaucracy that shouldn't even be there today, was, you can knock us down. The mainstream media can ignore him all they want. But in the hearts of freedom-loving Canadians, James Topp is synonymous with fighting for freedom. And just recently, another Canadian, I really call him a Canadian hero. He really is a man that I just talked to 2 hours ago. He called me from prison once again today. I get a call from Regina, from Michael Jackson. Mm-hmm. And, Michael Jackson, his only crime, and he's been sitting in lockup in the institution, the prison institution in Regina, since February 24th, if you can imagine. First 3 months until the end of May, he was in solitary confinement. And what's his crime? He and his estranged wife broke up. They're divorced. His 8-year-old daughter, Sarah, was looking like she was, well, not looking like, she was going to be vaxxed under Premier Scott Moe's regime in Saskatchewan last January, February. And they postponed it, and finally it was going to happen. And seeing no other option, he took his child away from his estranged and took her and kept her with him. But he sent her a message, a very clear message. I'm more than pleased to, surrender my own daughter back to you, but you have to ensure that you're not going to give my 8-year-old daughter, Sarah, the vax. And for that, there was a Canada-wide warrant for his arrest. And he has been languishing in a prison cell in Regina, Saskatchewan ever since. We can't let that happen in this country. I worked in the criminal justice system. I know what real criminals are. And when we see that, I guess the message I would say to anyone watching this podcast, if it can happen to Michael, it can happen to any one of us. If it can happen to Pastor Tim Stevens, it can happen to Pastor Coates, it can happen to any one of us. And that should send a chill up our spine. And we must be vigilant to take back our freedoms in this regard as well. By the way, with Michael, both taking back our freedoms as well as vaccine choice, we've set up a gift, send, go. And we've been fortunate to have a very good law firm represent him. And if anybody is wanting to have more information on that, they're more than welcome to reach me through TBOF or Ted Kuntz out at Vaccine Choice. And we're very encouraged. I spoke to a group of over 40 men last night challenging, and we're pretty confident. We're hoping to get maybe $10,000, $15,000 in that gift, send, go in the next week and be able to take that properly forward with an amazing law firm.
That's wonderful. So, George, coming back to some of the things that are going on in Canada right now, in addition to the work that TBOF is doing to support people like Michael Jackson, what about this terrible decision that came out of the Ontario Superior Court recently regarding the Western University's vaccine mandate? This must be very concerning to TBOF. Is your organization involved in continuing legal challenges of that nature?
We are, and we're just beginning to put some pieces together on a number of other initiatives regarding others like that. My son is in his fourth year of university in business, and fortunately here in Alberta, he does not have that to deal with. But any post-secondary in the country, and I would encourage anybody who may be watching from Bonavista, Newfoundland to Tofino, British Columbia, if you're watching, please reach out to us, because we want to, you have to appreciate our greatest focus and our greatest initiative is the court of public opinion. And we want these universities, we want these employers, we want anyone who is using the jab or using these failed policies, these unlawful mandates, these unlawful, I call them jabs, they're not a vaccine, to coerce particularly young people as holding their education or their careers over their head. It's got to stop, and we will never rest until we just wipe that right off the Canadian scene entirely.
So Take Back Your Freedoms has been going now for about a couple of years. Where do you see the organization going? What's your vision for the future of it, George?
Well, actually, Take Back Our Freedoms was it was where we stepped out of the boat on August 21st, just last year. So we're not even a year old yet. And that was another thing. The good Lord, if I'm going to give a shout out to anybody, I'm going to give a huge shout out to the good Lord. Somebody said to me when I was in Ottawa, there's a neat story in Ottawa I'll share with you. When we were in Ottawa, we got there that night and we were just coming out, and this ties into your question. We were coming into Ottawa. Brian Dennison was driving the rental van with my two boys and Roy Byer, and I was driving up with Dr. Paul Alexander and his wife and daughter, and we were both coming in around the same time. And Corporal Bulford said to me, he was in one war room and we were in another. He was in one hotel, we were in another, working with, because we were very determined if we were going to put our brand on anything and if we were going to work in anything, the only kind of demonstrations we would have anything to do with were peaceful demonstrations that would respect the rule of law, that would respect the process. We begin to be very resistant, but do it in a peaceful way and do it with solutions in mind through the proper due course and due process. Mm-hmm. We were coming into Ottawa, and Danny Bulford gave us a route that we could come in, and we were actually following almost like a police escort coming into Ottawa. When we got there, within a couple of days of being there, the first morning we went out the next day, it was just like everywhere else in the country. There was, you couldn't go into any restaurants without, a vax pass or all of these things, and masks and everything else. Up and down all of Slater Street and two or three other streets around in that whole downtown core, within 2 or 3 days, one restaurant, the Icon Cafe, and then the Subway, and then the shawarma place, and all up and down, the Tim Hortons and everything, they had new signs in their window. Freedom. Mm-hmm. No masks required, none of that. And it was just a beautiful thing to have happen. And to see, to your question, to see what can happen when citizens take a peaceful stand and support and are passionate about the rule of law. Even us, what does he call us? The undesirables, I guess, that fringe minority. I'm proud to be part of the fringe minority. We see a Canada going forward, first of all, to counter Mein Kampf we will never forget. We will never forget Normandy. We'll never forget the world wars, the battles. We'll never forget Desert Storm, because it affected our country as well. We'll never forget the blood that was soiled and people born, laid to rest in foreign fields for our freedom. And again, the greatest hero on our board representing that is Lieutenant Colonel David Redmond. And I salute you, David. You become a dear friend, and I cherish the friendship, and I salute you for your freedom. So first of all, we can never forget. Never forget. Second of all, the inquiry, working with other organizations and other people like, the heroic Mr. Manning and others, really taking a stand to find out what's happening, what has happened, and what can we do, and how can we have the court of public opinion say with us in unison across this country, independent of the media. We, the citizens of this country, are never going to let this happen again, and we must hold those politicians and the Dina Henshaws of the world, we must hold them accountable. They must be held accountable. And number 3, we must look at what we can do to have more citizen participation. And that's up to us as citizens. That's where the citizens' responsibility is. And then as we look forward, to go from almost oblivion, there's no reason over the next 10 to 20 years, and this is our legacy picture, to build within the very fiber of Canada, through TBOF's vision for the future, to build an eco-culture of freedom and love for country and God and the people that we serve, so that the politicians are not going to come to us 4 times a year telling us what they're doing, but they're going to come to us 4 times a year to hear what their report card is. In fact, a suggestion that came up on my Tuesday night group down at the Fresh and Local here in Calgary. It's every Tuesday night, about 40 to 60 men, and it's growing. It'll probably soon be 100 men. We're talking about the very things on legacy, because that's what TBOF wants to look to in the future. Where can we go, and what do we envision? And what we envision is to go from the worst democracy representation percentage of participation in the Western world, and all the Western world, I hate to say it, but we're the lowest percentage of participation in our democracy of all the G20 countries. To go from worst to best. And that's not a pipe dream. Dr. Modry will tell you this. When we have, we're about plus or minus 1% on any day of our participation. We're even worse than that on filling constituency association boards and all of that kind of stuff. When we go from 1%, it's not like we have to get to 20, although that'd be amazing. But when we cross, and Brian Peckford and I talked about this many times, when we can cross that line as citizens to 3.5% participation, we govern again. We absolutely govern. So our vision is, what if we could get to 5 to 7% in the next 10 years? And if it was TBOF's central mission after these inquiries to really look at the truth of the matter, that if citizens participate, government listens. And over the next 10 years, I believe it's achievable to get somewhere between 3 to 5% participation. And then Canada, when we achieve that, we can be the greatest light to the world of what a free and self-determined country can look like, with a reasonably low tax rate, probably the lowest in the Western world, and the greatest GDP. And let me speak about GDP. When we're talking GDP, I'm not talking about, I'm going to just call it right out here, I'm not calling about these big box stores that are part of globalism. I'm sick of that. I'm all for international trade. I'm just not for globalists. I'm all for international trade. But to be building here in Alberta, and Alberta once again will be the test case for this. It'll be the incubation for it, and it's going to happen. I know it's going to happen. Is we build local GDP, buy in Alberta, manufacture in Alberta, distribute in Alberta, distribute internationally, but grow local GDP, start supporting local Alberta merchants. And when we can do that and we can reduce our tax rate. We can follow Dr. Modry's challenge to have more leverage with Ottawa and keep more of our hard-earned tax dollars right here in Alberta and let the other provinces follow the Alberta model. That's our vision for TBOF. I'm excited. It's what keeps me going every day, because that's the kind of future I want my grandchildren to be born into and be raised in. And it can happen. It's going to happen. It must happen. And there's so many great Albertans and Canadians that I've met who are now beginning to sing that same song.
That's a great point. In fact, when Mr. Manning was on this program, he talked about populism. I know populism is a bad word, particularly for the left, but what he was talking about is this concept of do something, which is the title of one of his books. And yes, he quite agrees with you that what needs to happen is individual personal engagement with our communities as expressed through politics. And we're already starting to see signs that this is working. The Freedom Convoy is one example. And then recently there was a Saskatchewan MLA calling for an investigation into COVID-19 vaccination deaths. Well, that's happening because people are calling for that in the same way you're describing. Mr. Polyev is in Parliament during question period, and he's mopping up the floor with Prime Minister Trudeau, criticizing these travel restrictions and saying they should be removed. Lo and behold, they get removed. But he is only able to do that, to stand up in Parliament, because he has the support of Canadians who are getting involved in doing something the way Mr. Manning described. So I love that part of what you're saying, George, and I quite agree. That is the key, for Canadians going forward. Now, here's the last question I'm going to pose to you. So that sounds great. Canadians get involved. How can people do that? Practically speaking, how do people get involved in this process in the way that you're describing? What's the best way for them to do that?
That's a great question. You know, it was General Michael Flynn I heard recently on another one of my favorite podcasts is Steve Bannon's War Room.
Oh, terrific show. Yeah. Yeah,
great show. I haven't met Steve yet, but I know some of his close colleagues, and we're going to be doing some interesting stuff with those guys stateside soon. I think if I would just simply speak what Michael Flynn said. When you get involved locally, at your local provincial constituency association, with your local municipal police commission. We think, oh, well, that police commission, we never get involved. Yeah, we can actually. There's places to get involved with the police commission, to get involved with our local school boards, to get involved with our federal constituency associations as well. When we get involved, he simply put it this way: for citizens to look at their community and get involved, become active in the community that you live and love in. You just love where we live, then we need to get at. We need to take some stand for what's happening, instead of just sitting back and go, oh my gosh, look what's happening in the schools now. Look what it's happening with the police. Well, there's something we can say about that. And this is something that TBOF is evolving in, to begin to have some workshops that we can begin to really take it down to, let's call it the nuts and bolts of how can you participate. And it's getting involved at the local level, right within your humble constituency association for this upcoming election in Alberta next May. We got a new leader coming in October, but next May, God forbid, let's make sure we never have a socialist government ever in this province again. What can Albertans do today? What can people in any other province do today? Check on your local constituency association. Chances are that board is not even filled. You can probably find your way in there by acclamation. And I'm serious about that. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, that may not seem like a big step, but it's a huge step. Identify, we call it our tribe socials. There's a group of us freedom fighters, and we're not only TBOF passionate, we're TBOF passionate, we're passionate about APP, we're passionate about the freedom candidates, that one of whom I think will make the premiership in the next week or so. It's really getting engaged. And just last night, 46 men, and there's 3 of them that are going to let their names stand for the UCP constituency, for the board. the provincial board. There's another couple that are now engaged locally because we've been doing these workshops, and that's what Canadians can do. And every time you think it's a hill too high, a mountain too high to climb, think about this. For every activist, that I'm speaking to that 1% right now, the 1% that I've had the privilege, many of whom I've had the privilege of getting to know, unsung heroes all across the country the last year. That's probably one of the greatest thrills of my life. To give a shout out to all of you, Natalie Beresfeld and PEI, to Melissa Badine and Grand Prairie, and it just goes on, and I'm going to miss all of you because I can't name them all. But it's those are the heroes. Those are the heroes that oftentimes are not known outside their communities. But I can tell you in their communities that they're what give the whole province and the whole nation hope. And it's getting down to the fundamentals. And for that 1% that I'm talking to today, imagine this. If you just invite 3 to join you, the 1% in Canada over the next 3 years becomes the 4%. When we cross the Rubicon, that's 3.5% engagement, like I'm talking. We govern. They then know they work for us. And then this will never happen again.
That's a great point. And just to kind of finish it off, when Preston Manning was here and he talked along these lines, he said that, the universe abhors a vacuum. And where people like you are not there on these constituency boards, that's when the elites come in. And that's how we got where we are today, is because people over the past few decades have disengaged from politics locally. And when we're not taking care of our own communities, we're not engaging, these other people will come in. And because they will fill that vacuum and that void. And what you're talking about, that's the best way to prevent that from occurring, right?
And can I make one last comment too?
Absolutely.
For those of you, last fall, when we made an appeal for people to join us and join our crusade, and this was done intentionally because the website's changed since then. I remember Roy and I talking about it. We made an appeal to the unvaxxed. And then all of a sudden, Roy and I, before we posted it to our webmaster out in Ontario, we both called each other late one night and said, no, we got to do an edit of this. And we did this intentionally. And it was so exciting, Leighton, so exciting. We modified the site to say the following. Instead of "we invite you, the vaxxed," we changed it and said, "we invite all Canadians, starting with the vaxxed." Consider where you've been, even if you have buyer's remorse, and come and join our movement. We will welcome you. Because the other side, the media and the government, were trying to create a narrative that we're divided, the vaxxed and the unvaxxed. I have come to know and love so many of the vaxxed. And just in my own polls, about 85% of the vaxxed that I know were coerced into it. So we made an appeal to the vaxxed. My appeal on your wonderful Gray Matter podcast today is this. Any Canadian who is watching this, and I'm not going to say you're woke, I'm not going to say that at all. I'm not going to disrespect you. I love all Canadians. I have family and friends across this nation, particularly in PEI and Alberta. For those of us that have a different view than we have, I totally respect that view. But if you take a look at what's happened and the loss of freedoms in the last couple of years, and the devastation to our economy, and you know that you have loved ones that are not doing so well health-wise. And I'm talking to those who are still not at a place where they want to move forward. I know every single one of you, probably no exceptions. You probably all know a freedom fighter. You know someone who's been standing in the gap, standing alone. May I encourage you to call he or she, and by the way, no more. In my world, there's only 2 genders. To call he or she and ask what they've been doing and how has it been going. and ask them if you could have a coffee, and ask them what they've done in the last year to protect your freedoms. And then I appeal to you, because I have great love for you, the people who have never been involved. Come join us. It's a wonderful family of freedom fighters. And along with everything else, and I'm probably going to say this, every single one of our directors, including Mr. Peckford, and I said it with great respect, and every one of our advisors, when I was bringing them on, I said, listen, the only demand that I will make, George Bears, as one of the founders of this, is if you're going to come and join our team, the only thing you have to commit to is you must commit to having fun. We got to have fun. We got to enjoy the journey, and we've got to take back our freedoms. And just the journey itself has brought us into a series of relationships of our tribe, vaxxed and non-vaxxed alike, that are standing together and said, it's not what we're standing against with this, it's what we're standing for. We're standing for freedom. We're standing for an even better country than we've ever known. And we will achieve that once we pass the Rubicon of 3.5%. So my final appeal is for all of you 1%ers, find 4 or 5 to join you. For all of those who have never joined, we love you as well. Go and find one of those 1%ers and ask even to have a coffee, and how do we get engaged. God bless you, Leighton, and I want to thank you and all that you've done through your podcast for the cause of freedom. Great admiration, great respect.
Thank you, George. And it's been our great pleasure to have you on the program today. We've learned so much about Take Back Our Freedoms, and it's been a very, very illuminating conversation. We're now at the part of the program where we close with what we call the reading list. I have a couple of selections. I'm going to go first and let you maybe mull over any ideas you have. It doesn't have to be a book, and it can be a website or a paper or anything of that nature that you think would help people and in improving their understanding of the things you've been talking about today. The first book that I'm going to point to is called COVID-19 and the Global Predators, We Are the Prey. This is a book written by Peter Breggin and Ginger Ross Breggin. And the description is that COVID-19 and the global predators is much more than an analysis of the current exploitation of humanity under cover of the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. It discloses for the first time the actual blueprint and master plan that was 10 years in the making by global predators before the pandemic. I almost said plandemic. A plan to reorganize the world in the name of public health. Billionaires, government agencies, giant funds, and major industries collaborated years ahead of time to lay the groundwork for what would become Operation Warp Speed and the Great Reset in 2020. And all of this is disclosed. Individuals and groups are named, and their plans for the future are documented. This book concludes with chapter what America and the world must do in the coming weeks and months and years to save humanity's freedom. And it contains top medical and public health expert reports. The second book that I'm going to refer everyone to on this list is again a COVID-19 book, because that's been a major topic of our discussion today, but it ties into this broader narrative that George has been speaking to. This book is called COVID-19, The Greatest Cover-Up in History, From Wuhan to the White House. This is written by Dylan Howard and Dominic Utton. And the description here from the publisher is that in the final days of 2019, a new and deadly virus was quietly spreading through the city of Wuhan, China. Within 6 months, it would allegedly kill 500,000 people worldwide, infect a further 10 million, and change the way all of us live, work, and play forever. This book claims that now, for the first time, the real story of the greatest global crisis of the age can be told. Reporters Dylan Howard and Dominic Utton, collaborating from New York and London, infection hotspots in what would become 2 of the worst hit nations on earth, allegedly, have together mapped the rise, spread, and impact of the virus and uncovered some explosive revelations. This book delivers the unfettered truth about what is undoubtedly the biggest political scandal of our time. It shows in unprecedented detail how governments in China, the UK, and the US not only fail to protect their citizens from the threat of the disease, but actively conspired to put their own political and economic ideologies above the lives of ordinary people. And of course, this is a global situation, so all of this applies equally, and perhaps even more so to Canada, because as George rightly has pointed out during our discussion today, Canada seems to be the prime target, the focal point, the global focal point for this globalist ideology, and of course the COVID-19 pandemic and the agenda behind it, coming from Klaus Schwab and that ilk, has focused on Canada, as, in the words of Klaus Schwab, has infiltrated our cabinet. And anyone who has been watching our prime minister, as painful as that is to do, can see that, in the words of Jordan Peterson, he is simply the medium for the message, and one that many Canadians, especially Albertans, are now rejecting. So, George, those are my selections. Do you have any that you could add for the people who are taking in the podcast?
Yeah, for sure I do. First, a well-noted guest on podcasts across America is a real freedom fighter, true freedom fighter. I've heard on. Well, first of all, let me mention a podcast that I have great respect for. If you've ever watched Steve Bannon and his War Room, Steve Bannon's War Room, look it up, follow it. In fact, I will. Huge kudos to Steve. I haven't met him yet, but a lot of the ideas that we gleaned from TBOF, we gained from the enormous strategic podcast he's had, and he's tireless. Like, he's just tireless. He's just always in the face of the establishment, the globalists, and everything else. And it's just a great inspiration. Steve Bannon's War Room, highly recommended. And back to your earlier question, how do we take back our country? Listen to Steve Bannon's War Room and follow what he's recommending, because it applies to our country as well as his country. On that, one of his guests, I cannot speak highly enough, is Eric Metaxas. And there's a particular, if you look at Eric Metaxas and look at his challenge to the churches, he made an incredible case over the last, I think it was like 3 weeks ago, he first came out with this. And unfortunately, I can't think of his book, but you look up Eric Metaxas and his books that he's written. I haven't gotten his newest book yet, but he has a great book. Heard him a couple of weeks ago. One of the persons that he identifies, his message to the churches is as follows. He cites a person in Germany, and I've read this book and love it, Bonhoeffer. You want to read a good book, read Bonhoeffer. And
that's on our reading list already, actually, that one.
That's great. Yeah. And he also, when he talked about Bonhoeffer, this is what he said, and this is what his book articulates. He said the parallels between Nazi Germany and the woke culture and the Great Awakening that was needed is such a parallel of the last 30 months. And he used 18,000 churches throughout Germany in 1932-33, before the war had even started. And he said there was a breakdown like this of 18,000 churches, about 3,000 that were all sold out for the Nazi Holocaust, the whole thing. Sadly, that's where they were. There were 3,000 that made up the Bonhoeffers, and I'm not sure if this is people or churches. I believe it was churches that made up the ratios are the same anyway. There was 3,000 who said, no, we're going to resist. And there was that 12,000 in the middle said, well, we'll go along to get along. We don't want in church. We'll go with what they say. And the segue that he did for the U.S., same could be said in Canada, unfortunately, has been that same challenge of all of those churches. And, the Bonhoeffers of our day that we know about are Pastor Stevens, Pastor Pawlowski, Pastor
Coates,
Pastor Coates.
Right.
They are the ones who've taken. So that's a book that Eric has that I highly recommend. Bonhoeffer, I highly recommend. And of course, probably no surprise to yourself, the book that I've read the most, and I've read a lot, is got 66 books within the book, and it's the Bible. And I've got a fair bit of it memorized, particularly the battle ones. And I can tell you, the greatest thing I could say regarding that book is the energy I've got and the freedom I've got and the vision the Lord has given me. And it's all just amazing. I give full kudos to that. And there's an author who has had 2 books that I've practically got memorized. His name is Alan Redpath. And he published his book, one of the books that I recommend, back in 1955. But you can still find him. You can get it anywhere but Amazon. Go somewhere else. But it's called Victorious Living in the Book of Joshua. And it was Joshua's day crossing the Jordan. And man, there's been a lot of crossing the Jordan the last year. Unbelievable. And another one is Alan Redpath's book on the book of Nehemiah. And that's great. And, I guess I don't want to be self-promotion, but I wrote 3 freedom songs. I wrote many freedom songs. But if anybody ever wanted to get a copy, I'm probably going to record these soon. But I wrote a song one time called Lady Liberty. And another song that I wrote was called Touch the Wind. And they're songs about freedom. And if I could just give you just a short snapshot of Lady Liberty. This is a song I wrote, and I'm not going to sing it. I'm just going to share the lyrics of it, but it's very appropriate. I was on the South Tower, the lookout of the South Tower of the World Trade Center in 1986, returning to Prince Edward Island from spending 4.5 months in Florida, Boca Raton, Florida, singing in the Irish pubs down there, actually. I was an old Irish pub singer back in those days. And I was up on the South Lookout, looking out over Ellis Island at Lady Liberty. And it just moved my heart because I love what America, Canada, United States is about. I love the freedoms that we enjoy. And got back home, wrote it with an RCMP officer friend of mine. And guess this has been my heartbeat for the last 36 years. And I've written many songs about this. But here are the words that I think maybe Canadians can embrace. The freedoms, wrote this in 86 with a friend of mine. The freedoms that we enjoy are the roots of democracy. A lot of people had to die for what they believe. So take a moment out of every day and stand straight and tall. And remember, to my Canadian friends, this is about America, but it could also be said about Canada. And remember Arlington Cemetery. They died for us all. A lot of men are buried with flowers on their graves. They fought for peace and liberty. As soldiers, they were brave. They fought for America's freedom. In vain, they did not die. Our flag withstood the test of time. Now our stars light up the sky. There's a lady standing tall. That's the backbone of this land. A feeling of pride starts happening when I see the torch in her hand. She represents the freedom that we know and we hold so dearly. She stands alone, but she's not forgotten. She's Lady Liberty. There's no room for battlefields, just love and loyalty. In this land that we're so proud of, that was built on integrity. Our people are free from bondage. We will endure for eternity because we will shed our blood. We will give our lives for the cause of liberty. There's a lady standing tall. That's the backbone of this land. A feeling of pride starts building when I see the torch in her hand. She represents the freedom that we know and we hold so dearly. She stands alone, but she's not forgotten. She's Lady Liberty.
That's brilliant, George. Thank you so much for sharing that. I hope you do record it. And more than that, thank you so much for being with us today on Gray Matter. It's been a wonderful conversation. I know that all of our viewers will really enjoy taking it in. And I would urge them to visit your website and find out more about TBOF and how they can get involved in fighting the fight that you've been talking about today. Because really, in the words of Winston Churchill, this is not the end. It's not the beginning. It's merely the beginning of the end. And there's much, much more work to do, and has to be done by everyone who cares about freedom, everyone who is inspired by the song that you wrote, by those words. And it's hard to imagine anyone who could not be, unless you hate freedom, in which case you're probably not watching this podcast. And if you are, I hope that we changed your mind. Anyway, thanks very much, George, for being with us today. It's been, as I said, it's been our great pleasure to have you as our special guest on Grey Matter. We hope to have you back sometime in the future to update us on some of the projects that you're working on with Take Back Our Freedoms.
Thank you so much, Leighton. All the best, and God bless you.
Thank you.
And God bless.